With that, we have a lot of business to take care of, and with that, let's bring in our leadoff guests on this Wednesday night. Philip Rooker, Pulitzer Prize-winning senior Washington correspondent for the Washington Post. Alicia Menendez, host of American Voices, weekends at 6 p.m. Eastern on this very network. Also happens to be host of the podcast Latina to Latina. Eugene Robinson, Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist, also with the Washington Post. And A.B. Stoddard, veteran Washington journalist, associate editor and columnist for Real Clear Politics. Eugene, I'd like to begin with you. The president tonight spoke in the way presidents have spoken to the American people, traditionally, over the years, over the generations. Stylistically, one difference, an extraordinary amount of the use of tone, at times speaking to a whisper. That may have owed to the sparse population of that cavernous chamber, and it may have translated very intimately to television viewers. On the content, in your view, did he hit the mark?
Well, on the content, I really think it was a pretty extraordinary speech. It's certainly extraordinary in the sense that it was a speech that we have not heard from a president in the last 40 years. And could not have heard from a president in the last 40 years, since the Reagan era. And I was struck by something actually that Tim Scott said in response. He said there was a feeling that this nation is sliding off its shared foundations, and there was that same feeling in the country at the end of the Jimmy Carter administration. And so in came Ronald Reagan, and he used that moment to shift the center of gravity of our political spectrum substantially to the right. Government was the enemy. The idea was to get government out of your business, and trickle down economics was the only economics that worked, and that's kind of where we've been until now, or at least until now in Joe Biden's vision. This was a speech in which he spoke expansively of the role that big government can play in making our lives better, in making us safer and healthier and more productive and more secure. He said trickle-down economics have never worked. Even though that's been the reigning orthodoxy for 40 years. We're at a moment because of the tumult of the Trump years and then the catastrophe of COVID, when I think he believes the nation is receptive to this sort of message and needs this sort of message. And so he really went big in the speech.
Great point about Jimmy Carter, who came back after a Camp David sojourn, gave a speech to the nation about our decay, including our moral decay, but did not exhort the way a Joe Biden used exhortation tonight in that speech to our better angels and to our better history. Alicia, I have something for you. Joe Biden could not help but reference behind him tonight.
Madam Speaker, Madam Vice President, no president has ever said those words from this podium. No president's ever said those words, and it's about time.
Alicia, that was not a superficial thing. That was an important moment the president chose to highlight.
Yeah, hard to overstate the significance of that, Brian. I mean, the American public watching, expanding our sense, our definition of what a leader is, who a leader is, what a leader can look like, who is worthy of power, who is capable of pulling off a elbow bump and still looking exceptionally cool. I think, though, all of that would have fallen a little flat or would have felt a little empty if there also wasn't so much in this speech, both policy-wise and rhetorically, that really spoke to the women of America. So I'm of the belief that any issue is a women's issue, immigration is a women's issue, climate change is a women's issue. But when you talk about the American Families Plan, there was a lot in the speech tonight that was really, really targeted at women. So you talk about a historic investment in childcare. That's an issue for women on both sides, both because women rely on childcare in order to participate in the workforce, and because women are very often the ones providing that care. They're a big part of the care economy, and so it is an economic issue for them on both sides. You talk about paid family leave, paid medical leave, making that universal and guaranteed. Women are the majority of Americans who do not currently have that type of paid leave. Even something like universal pre-K, which of course is for our children and making sure that our children are educated and competitive, it also has an impact on women. It's very often a determinant of whether or not they participate in the workforce. So I go back to the framework, Brian, that he offered at the beginning of the speech, which was this idea of crisis and opportunity. He used that, he wove it throughout the entire speech. When it comes to this question in particular, the crisis for women in this country is crystal clear. He laid it out. 2 million women lost their jobs during this pandemic. A quarter of women in this country say that their family's financial situation is worse now than when the pandemic began. The crisis is very real to American women. What he began to do tonight was to lay out and offer up what the opportunity for deep structural change could really look like.
Phil Rucker, where are we on unity? Something the president touched on in his remarks, often using that frequency modulation when he reduced his voice to a whisper. Still extraordinary in that chamber. It was often to try to get Republicans with him. Just as often, it was to make a point to the audience at home that he is trying to get support for these initiatives.
It's exactly right, Brian. I think the president was looking straight past those members of Congress in the chamber and talking directly to Americans at home. He was talking about bipartisanship. He was talking about trying to listen to what Republicans want to do, trying to find some compromise. He knows many of those Republicans stayed seated throughout the speech. They didn't agree with him on different things, and yet Biden talked about not wanting to be confrontational, for example, on the issue of gun control. And then when you look at the substantive elements of his jobs plan, which is a massive plan on the scale of the kind of growth in this country we saw 100 years ago during FDR. So many of those elements are very popular, polling will tell us, with the American people. And Biden tried to drive that home. He said this is a blueprint, a blue-collar blueprint for America. He talked about jobs, about creating better jobs for people, giving them a better livelihood and a better foundation for their families. He knows that Mitch McConnell, Kevin McCarthy, and their members in their caucuses do not agree ideologically with the substance of those policies, and yet he was trying to sell them, I think, tonight to the American people listening at home.
A.B. Stoddard, it falls upon you to comment on something just handed to me from social media from the insurrection-curious Trump acolyte Republican leader in the House. That would be Mr. McCarthy of California, who wants so very badly to be Speaker of the House. This whole thing could have just been an email. Poetic, artful, perhaps, A.B. For those who did not listen to every word of Tim Scott's rebuttal, where does this Biden speech put the Republicans?
Well, to touch on what Phil was talking about, I think that the administration worked extremely hard and strategically to send a message to voters outside their coalition who maybe voted for President Trump once or even twice. Buy American, stand up to China, lower prescription drug prices, a blue-collar blueprint for new jobs that do not require a college degree or an associate's degree. It went on, and he went over the kind of liberal, progressive wish list, priority list in the second half of the speech, and he prioritized reaching the median voter in the middle of the speech. Of course, it was not a good look when Kevin McCarthy and the Republicans stayed seated for cutting child poverty in half, but they're not going to vote for that, and that came as no surprise. I did think that, Senator Scott's response was extraordinarily well done. Some of the things he said, you could differ with his policy points on, but setting him up as the responder and not picking some, Andy Biggs from Arizona type of Republican member to respond, and then having him kind of be the person who potentially might be going up against Stacey Abrams on these voting right measures, I thought was very shrewd. But you're going to hear from Republicans that this was all too expensive, and it's impossible now that Trump's out of office to do expensive things. But I think it will be really tough for them to be fighting back on a lot of the provisions that Biden made a point to highlight that they knew had pulled well, and they knew reach across the aisle, and they knew would be attractive to members of the Trump coalition. Support for elderly caregivers, all these things that he made a point beyond just ending cancer, of really speaking to the needs of the social safety net and the challenges, the economic challenges to the middle of the country, and not just voters in the Democratic coalition. So it was clear that that was their goal. I think they did that effectively.
Fantastic analysis from our four friends, so much so that we would like more. We're going to take